Tripod, the official Trinity University Press podcast, invites authors, journalists, community leaders, and other guests to engage in exploratory, informative discussions on the subjects of people, places, and the planet. I'm Lily Brennan, and welcome back to another episode of Tripod, the official podcast of the Trinity University Press. Joining me today is Julia Martin, Professor Emeritus in the Department of English at the University of the Western Cape, published essayist, and author of several titles, including her most recent Trinity University Press publication, On the Sponge Islands, Loss and Restoration in the Aegean. Martin is here to discuss her visits to the islands and all the sponge divers of the past and present have to teach us about people, places, and our planet. Welcome, Julia Martin.
Thank you so much, Lily.
Well, can you just give a brief introduction to yourself and how you ended up being in Cape Town?
Yeah, I've taught for many years, taught English literature, often with an environmental focus.
When did your career with teaching or writing start?
Ages ago. I've recently retired, so I was teaching at the University of the Western Cape, which is a very interesting place. I was there for 40 years, which is sort of crazy, but now I'm not doing that anymore.
What drew you to the subject in the first place?
It was a slightly odd coincidence of things. I had sabbatical. I wanted to go to Greece. My husband saw a photograph of Simi, the island of Simi, online, and it looked amazing, really beautiful. So then I thought, okay, what is going on in the islands around Simi? Because Simi is part of the Dodecanese. And I did a little bit of research. I found out that sponges were forever the sort of engine of the economies of those places. People used to dive for sponges. These sort of humble objects were actually essential in civilization in the area. And then there's a whole history that emerges from that. So I realized, okay, here's a possibly interesting eco/social nexus that I could take as a thread that I could hold and take to a story. It turned out that the sponges were a very rich, evocative presence, so that they really did lead everywhere. Yeah.
For myself and others, do you want to clarify just what sponge diving is and what that means?
Okay, so these days in the kitchen we will use a sponge, but until mid 20th century or early 20th century, people used in Europe and elsewhere a living being which was an animal. It looks like a plant, but it was an animal, and that was something which was used for all sorts of cleaning, all sorts of body care things, and a sort of essential object in society way back as far as we know. And those sponges were initially for millennia dived out of the sea by the biggest heroes on the islands in this area. So they're the sort of Adonis, somebody who could, as you say, free diving, take an amazing deep breath and go right down, holding a flat stone, which they use almost as a sort of like a rudder that sort of takes them down. But on that breath, they would then, with a knife, cut sponges from the bottom of the seabed and bring them back. It definitely limited the amount of sponges you could take out because you're going down on one breath. In the 1860s, 1863, the invention of the deep sea diving suit was an absolutely pivotal moment. The first one that was brought to the islands. Because suddenly now you could put on this thing, those classic big masks over his head. You could go down deeper than ever before and longer than ever before. And sponge diving became a completely different matter, taking out way, way too much, and becoming massively wealthy. And even the divers themselves, not just the captains and the merchants, but even the divers themselves becoming very wealthy. But it was extremely dangerous as well because you get the bends, you stay down too long, you come up too fast, and people died in astounding numbers and were paralyzed. In one sense, it seemed to bring great wealth to the islands and they built beautiful buildings, but at quite a cost, quite an environmental cost and quite a human cost.
Well, thank you for that description. That was perfect. But also, to touch on a few of the things you said of just the suit itself was such a visual shock. When I see those, you see, it's the first thing I think of, when I was a kid, seeing that picture is like SpongeBob, like a cartoon, where the
Right.
deep sea diver is wearing that big orb mask and you can barely see out of it. And it looks so heavy. And that was very well described in the book as well. But to think about somebody actually using that to dive and then have to somehow come back to the surface, relying on somebody else on a boat, knowing when to pull you up so you
Yes.
don't, get the bends or become ill. And even if
Yeah.
they do it right, there's no guarantee if your body will adjust.
Yeah, quite terrifying. And when they did a reenactment recently, and it was actually a young woman who went into the diving suit, a very good professional diver, she told me about it. She said it was unbelievably heavy. It was not in the water, but walking along the pier to get
Yeah.
in the water. It was all she could do. And she's a very strong swimmer and so on, to just hold on, just hold it.
I can't imagine. And I think it was brought to life so well by your style of writing, which the book describes it as lyrical. And then before we get into sort of the messages and takeaways, I just wanted to talk a bit about your writing style and how you sort of came to that style of writing.
But it's a nice word. I mean, it's nice to have that said about it. I don't think it all is like that. I think quite a lot of it is conversations with people, and some of it's quite a lot of information, which I try and produce for the reader in a way that is not like, oh, now suddenly we're changing gear into facts. But lyrical, I guess I've read a lot of poetry. I used to teach a lot of poetry. So my ear is quite tuned to the sounds. And it's what I say to people teaching creative writing. Read it aloud to yourself and slowly, so that your ear, it's hard to even say what it is that you're listening for, but you can hear it clang if it's not right. So the lyricism, if it's there, is from listening and listening and listening to the sounds, and hoping they make some kind of music.
I think there is absolutely a cadence that feels right to every language or order of speaking. But I think also just the way that your interviewees and other people on the island told their stories, it had a natural flow. You kept being engaged by their word choice or their sort of cavalier attitude to how much life was lost or, the real dangers they were put in. It would definitely bring you back in like a song kind of does, like a hook.
And it's like something magical happens when you said you don't travel like that. But the thing is, I found if one travels with a question, rather than just being on holiday, people will open up to you and relate to you in completely different ways from if one is there just to see. So that's what happened in those conversations. They're a gift as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think that's good advice to anyone traveling anywhere or even just day to day. Having
Yeah.
a reason to engage with others and engage with what you do makes every day a little more interesting. And on that sort of note of your questions, what did you hope to convey to your readers and what do you want them to take away from this book?
There's a quality of attention and care that I hope to convey. I hope to convey that what happened in the Aegean, in the Mediterranean, with the sponges is in a sense a sort of metaphor for me of our global catastrophe. And so I suppose I wanted to convey something about how precious and fragile and beautiful these places are and these people are, and really worth caring for and doing something to preserve because it's so beautiful, because it's so precious, this world, really.
The takeaway, I think, could not have been said better of just there is so much beauty. There has been catastrophe, but there is hope for moving forward. And I think we'll definitely get to those pieces of the book throughout our conversation. But I'd like to start with some questions related to the people and community. Even from the get-go of your first section in part one of the book, Genya is the title of that opening section, and that's a woman's name, very closely connected to the sponge history. Would you mind opening with telling that story?
I thought it was a good place to start in the book. Forever people have been diving and they dived naked to get the sponges. Then in 1863, somebody called Fotis Mastoridis comes back to the island of Simi, which is the island we went to first, with this new deep sea diving suit. And it's this, fantastic invention. And none of the divers, none of the men want to put it on. And so Fotis gets his wife, who was pregnant, and we don't know how coercive it was. I hope not. I like to think that she somehow had a kind of choice in the matter and somehow enjoyed it, but got her to put it on, and everybody assembles, and she goes down and stays down longer than anyone could have, and brings back a stone from very deep down, which, to prove how far she's been. And it was this absolutely pivotal moment, and her name is Evgenia. And so I like the fact that in a very super macho environment of diving, the first person to actually initiate this change, which was a very ambivalent change, was a woman.
It felt so much a moment of Greek mythology, of this woman who's been almost, connected to this pivotal moment of history, and the decision she makes next will create this myth across time. That's how I felt reading that moment of it, to see a woman who's pregnant being put into this unknown metal suit and dropped into the ocean to just show everybody that they can do it. And I think there were many moments throughout the book where women were a critical part of this history of sponges. They're sort of woven into the story through sacrifice, a lot of sacrifice. And you talk about how, to make political connections, women were traded with the sponges as sort of these luxurious items, but also women were running the household for half the year while the men were diving. And I was wanting you to maybe expand a bit on women's role in the sponge history, despite it being heavily connected to men.
Men are at the center, they're doing the stuff, but actually women are at home having a very powerful role in the community, it seems, for 7 months of the year, because the fleet would leave and they'd go to North Africa where there were still sponges. For me, the most poignant and evocative image of this and of what the women had to cope with, the thing that really gets to me is on the island of Kalymnos, which is, they still call it the island of the sponge divers, and they still send out a few boats, but there isn't a lot of diving there. When the fleet came home, all the bells would start ringing on the island. Everybody comes running down to the port to greet the boats. The wives would bring a black shawl down to the harbour, because you never know who is going to be a widow when you get there. And for me, that's just such an extraordinary image of kind of fortitude and grief and the extent of it.
That was, very poignant, as you said. And it definitely made me think, of course, of the women in this story, but also how the machismo and sort of the toxic masculinity being at sort of the center of the story. And I couldn't help but think of so many other parallels, as you talked about at the beginning of our conversation, between the sponge diving industry and our other modern industries today. My first thought was sort of coal mining towns and how many men were sent into the mines and died in collapses and things like that. I was wondering if that also brought an example in particular that you can think of. Enjoying this episode with Julia Martin? Check out her book, On the Sponge Islands, Loss and Restoration in the Aegean, now available for purchase on the Trinity University Press website and anywhere you buy books. Use Tripod's discount code SPONGE, that's SPONGE, to save 20% on your purchase of On the Sponge Islands at tupress.org.
Isn't a clear one for me, but it's like boom and bust things, where something creates a lot of wealth for a while and then it crashes. What was unusual, I think, with this was that the men were actually bringing home quite a lot of money, and while it lasted. So I think it is like, I think the mining example is a good one, and people were very risky, but their lives are still pretty marginal. They're not becoming absolutely crazy conspicuous consumption. So I mean, we these days like the word toxic masculinity. I don't use it in the book, but it's that sort of thing, I guess. Although, as soon as you label it, you realize that it's we as people who did not experience it can't really imagine what it's like. And one of the divers who I spoke to, who was functioning after this particular diving suit was no longer in use anymore, but he was diving and it's dangerous, and he was out for 6 months a year. He just said it was paradise. Once having stopped, it's like an amputation. So I think there was something euphoric as well about it. It wasn't just hardship. It was just massive in all sorts of ways, I think.
Yeah, it does. It defies categorization, like you said, the toxic masculinity or a sexist way of working and things like that. Though there are parallels with other industries that are obvious in the book, but it does defy it in that way of there is this beauty to it. And even the men you're speaking to about it, sometimes they're cavalier about the tragedy of it. They do have this love of the sea. It's like this deep connection to nature and place that it doesn't fit with, mining or producing steel or cement, just having to provide. This is like, it's a dream for many of these people. And even those who are left, losing limbs or paralyzed still wish that they could go back and do it one more time. Beyond sort of the gender and the gender roles of the book, you also talk a lot about youth and wisdom and the dynamics between younger sons and daughters and then their parents. And in speaking to Petros, I believe, about agriculture, he talks about that the youth are not interested and the old people can't do it anymore. Can you expand on that sort of dynamic that you saw on the islands?
Yeah, and maybe I should say that Petros, he died this morning, we heard. Maybe I can just read a bit of, just almost to honor Petros.
I'd love to hear it, yes.
So this is Petros Psarophagia, who we heard died this morning, and he was an old fisherman. And here I'm talking with him about the scaphandro, which is the name they gave to this diving suit. Scaphandro, just to name it, was an invocation. Satan's machine may be the shadow at the heart of the whole endeavor, but nobody seemed to be able to speak about it. His face became troubled, remembering. I know a lot of small poems, he said, beginning to cry a little. What the mother used to say to her husband, her son, when he was leaving. Then he told us a woman's wish. It was a poem not for her own man, but for the one who helped him put on the scaphandro, that irreplaceable comrade who held in his hands the lifeline back into the world. She would say, he must have the mind of the salmon and the wisdom of David, Petros said. That's beautiful, I said. If you're a salmon, it means that even if you go far away, you'll know how to return. Petros was choked up with tears. When I asked for more poems, he shook his head. The scaphandro had a way of silencing things. There was nothing more to say. And I asked about his name. Petros says he doesn't want to be called by his surname, Panos had explained earlier. He prefers his nickname, the name he inherited from his father, Psarophagia. The old man smiled. The story of his name was made perfect with so many tellings. It was a special day, he said, to eat a special fish. It was the week before Easter, and on that day, people had to eat kolios. His father, he said, was up with the animals at the cave near the almond trees. It was the same place where the women and children were burned by pirates long ago. On that particular day, it was raining hard, and it was too difficult to come back. It was the day for eating the special fish, but nobody brought him food, so he made his own fish from cream. Afterwards, everyone called him Psarophagia, the fish eater. It became his name, and Petros inherited it. Panos wrote the name in my notebook, Petros tis Psarophagias. So I just wanted to read that to honor Petros, who passed away today.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. It's fantastic.
Lovely. Yeah, but as a visitor who's flown in from across the planet, one can see there's a certain loss in those communities. You see these terraces that are abandoned, where they used to plant grapes and all sorts of things. Nobody planting them anymore. So the kind of challenge now, I think, for those islands is how to become more sustainable in a smart, green way, in a way that is not backbreaking. But yeah, young people, everybody wants to get the vegetables from the supermarket. But there's, a kind of ambiguity about that. We saw animals being treated pretty badly. Dogs are chained up and so on. And then we saw other people with a little dog and everything's, very different. That the old way of treating animals is part of the package of pre-globalized agriculture, and which I've been lamenting in a sense, and yet modernity has now taken us into another place.
Trinity University Press is a mission-driven publisher committed to civic engagement with timely ideas facilitated by the publication of print and digital books, related media, creative and educational programs, and other activities that help us all better understand our place in a crowded world. For more than 50 years, Trinity University Press has published more than 225 titles and organized thousands of events, all focused on broadening our understanding of many impactful subjects, from human relationships with our physical environments to social equity and justice. For more information about Trinity University Press, visit tupress.org. The images that you create with like the yellow dog in the middle of the town being, chained to a tree, it's not something that most people or people who live in urban areas have seen. I mean, of course, even San Antonio, you're used to the feral cats running around and stray dogs and things like that, but that's not as a result of somebody honoring an older way of living. I found that to be very interesting, that there was a benefit to the islands evolving in that animals were being treated differently. But as you said, at the same time, there's that loss of a self-sufficient place.
The book is in part about living and dying, and it sort of is this mystery that we cannot really get our minds around, because our only experience of life has got us in it. So we can't really imagine what it's like for it not to be like that.
I think that is a perfect picture of that notion of time passing and how nothing lasts, and you have to enjoy what you have and also plan for the future. On sort of a final note of the people and community, the notion of the heart comes up a lot. And I was just hoping you could define that a little bit and your experience with people talking about it. I know that is definitely impossible to define, but just in the way that people were speaking of it, because I found it very interesting.
It's some sense of openness and a quality of connection with people that is not really rational, but just we are human beings. We can get beyond the differences of language and culture and so on to actually just relate to this other person as a human.
I think it's a very difficult thing to define. And I think in those moments, you became more and more connected to this place through its people, which I would like to sort of talk about place now and those themes that are explored, which one of the first things that is obvious about where you visited is the sea. And it's said that you can be attached to the sea because it's always changing. It's not a thing, it's alive. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, that was a lovely, just this comment from somebody right at the beginning. We're on roads. We haven't even got to the small islands yet. And we're gazing out at this utterly fabulous blue Aegean. And I think what it means is that the more we cling and attach ourselves to things, the more vulnerable we are in terms of them changing. So you can't be attached to them because they're going to change. But if the thing itself is not really a thing, if it's actually something which is in flux, you can love it because it's that it's changing. It absolutely is not a thing. It's an absolutely a manifestation of change and impermanence.
Your explanation of it makes it even more profound, I would say. It felt beautiful in the moment of reading it. And I think it grows to have more meaning as you get through the book. Because I was trying to think, because I am in San Antonio and I'm originally from Chicago, there's not much water, but even the idea of nature and the seasons changing, no matter where you are, even if you're in a city, there are things like that, whether it's the weather, the sun, things will change. We can't connect to our objects because those will fade, right? Those will not be with us, but our world and our nature will always be changing. I think it was very beautiful, but the constants like the sea and things like that, I felt like there was a lot of things that felt missing from the story in a really nice way I felt like technology did not exist other than when Google Translate would be used every now and then. Is that accurate to your experience? Did it feel sort of far away?
I had my phone, but yeah, it wasn't really about that stuff. I've got an iPad, I've got a laptop, all those things are with me, but they weren't foregrounded. They weren't really majorly part of it. And we did get off social media and not really know too much about the news when we were there. So it was refreshing in that way.
I felt refreshed reading it. Like I didn't have the urge to pick up my phone. The only time I would reach for my phone is if there was a word in Greek that you shared and I didn't know it and I wanted to know. But I think in that it made your use of technology in the book and in my reading using my technology in that way, it felt like I was getting back to when people say that our advances and technology are good and beautiful, it feels hard to disconnect and be immersed in a place. But reading this book and engaging with it in this way, it felt very refreshing.
Yeah, and I really don't want to imagine some kind of, we've all got to go back to some imaginary past. The only solutions that these islands are offering in terms of our environmental crisis is high tech. There's got to be very cutting edge tech. I mean, this is not a spoiler really, that the book is sort of framed by a description of a deep time, which is the fact that these sponges are 640 million year old, sort of crazy ancient, which again, our cutting edge tech has given us some window into.
That technological element really helped me reframe my perspective on it, which was surprising. How did it feel to be a tourist in a place that's been so, I mean, now relies so heavily on tourism and has sort of not suffered, but changed due to tourism and modernity and things like that?
I think somebody says to me, our industry is tourism now, and it's essential to who they are. We all like to imagine we are a different kind of tourist when we go to a place like that. But yeah, it's an ambivalent feeling. It's fabulous. It's so beautiful, and you feel so lucky, and it's amazing. And it's ambivalent. I think tourism everywhere in the world does that. But on these islands, there are many different kind of categories of visiting. There's all sorts of levels of engagement as a visitor or a tourist.
But those travelers who get to stay longer, I think, are some of the only ones who get exposed to the kinds of people actually live there and what it means to live there, which reminded me of, I think his name is Stavros, and just that he's selling herbs and being part of the environment. And he has to know so much about his environment and what impacts it, which you do describe him as an environmentalist, that he's just this natural born caretaker of his environment. And I wanted to ask if you thought, if we were all more knowledgeable in that way about the animals and the plants that impact us, do you think we would all be more likely to be environmentalists?
Yeah, definitely. I think the more we know about the living world, the more we can care about it.
I think before ending on sort of that note of the beauty we find and how knowing more can make us appreciate our place and planet more, I did want to talk a bit about how the beauty and suffering are inextricable on these islands. It's said that commercialization is ruining things in the islands, and even the machine that's brought there is Satan's machine. It's a devilish harbinger of a mechanized way of life, as it's said in the book. And I guess I'm just curious how that beauty and suffering can exist at the same time, and if you've learned something about that from your visits.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just is like that. It came to me very strongly. We're up on the hill, and there's this utterly glorious view down from a little chapel, and then we realize, oh my God, there's a donkey tied up right here, and it just seemed like such a manifestation of how the two are just inextricable. They're there, and we want to untie the donkey, and but then what? So I think it's what life is like, but like that. I don't really have an answer as to why it's like that. It just felt as though they made me more attuned to suffering, because it's it's so beautiful and so awesome in the real sense, and then you feel the pain of the donkey or the stories of these people and on the sponges. You feel it more than in our usual life.
In response to that, the machine, which is sort of the villain in a lot of ways, there are also those who rage against the machine, which made me laugh thinking of the band, but also just that it's accurate of people who continue to live this natural way of life and continue to learn about their environment and care about their place. How do you think we can live and care about the natural way of life?
I don't even think that one wants to entirely rage against the machine. As I was saying earlier, the really exciting things that are happening on Chalki, for example, involves very clever, smart machines. I don't know. We need people who really care about what is valuable and what is sustainable and what is nurturing to all beings.
I think that's a good correction, not rage, but to build better machines, to think of our machines differently. The islanders talk about, and you, through speaking to them, talk about how action is impossible without hope. Life goes on, and that is the beauty.
That gave me a lot of hope.
Yeah, I think looking towards the islands and reading books like this, it certainly gave me a lot of hope, and that hopefully will help others and myself take action in that way that the islanders are as well. But thank you so much, Julia, for making the time to answer these questions and be here today.
Pleasure. And thank you for your time and for doing this.
Yeah, I had such a great time talking with you. Thank you for joining Julia and I for another episode of exploring people, places, and our planet with Tripod. Come back soon.